For today's session, for the first keynote session of today, we have Mr. Aslam Perwaiz with his keynote on the earthquake safety in the context of climate change. Mr. Aslam Perwaiz is the Executive Director of Asian Disaster Preparedness Center, ADPC. He holds a master's degree in statistics and has been involved in various global and regional initiatives on disaster risk reduction, climate resilience, business continuity planning, and digital resilience. He has substantive fieldwork experience from more than 20 countries, Asia, Pacific, and Africa, with national and subnational work program development and implementation in emergency preparedness, planning, post-disaster damage and loss assessment, recovery planning, private sector resilience, training and capacity building framework, and curriculum development. Mr. Aslam serves as the member of the Asia Pacific Scientific and Technical Advisory Group, APSTAG, and the Strategic Advisory Group, SAG, United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, UNDRR. He is also the expert group member of the Global Catastrophic Risks, GCR, led by the Center for the Study of Existential Risk, CSER, at the University of Cambridge. I would like to invite our very distinguished and respected speaker, Mr. Aslam Perwaiz, for the keynote presentation.
Thank you, Prashant, and good morning, namaste to everyone. Okay, so you must have observed in the introduction made by Prashant that I am not an structural engineer. Neither I would claim that I know too much on earthquake engineering. But the journey about how it feels when an earthquake strikes goes back, and today I am quite privileged also to have two very important persons in the room in front of whom I have to deliver the keynote speech. First, of course, Richard Sharp. I think you all know about him, and you must have heard yesterday or today. Way back in the year 2000, we traveled together many places in India, and then later part in Gujarat earthquake in the post-disaster situation. From there, of course, Ramesh, I would always admire you, our time in Kirman, after the bomb earthquake in Iran, how difficult it was at that time to convince people that the amount that you invest in disaster preparedness perhaps would help you to get more dividend when any disaster strikes. First of all, thank you very much for inviting ADPC for this very important conference on earthquake engineering. Thanks to the Ministry of Home Affairs, Government of Nepal, and DRRMA for hosting it, and of course, NSET, which is one of the organizations totally dedicated for the earthquake safety for almost 40 years. And I'm quite proud as well to know 𝐀𝐬𝐤 𝐏𝐞𝐫𝐰𝐚 for almost about 30 years from now, and have been quite privileged. With some of you, I have known you, but at ADPC, we do work mostly on disaster preparedness, and this is exactly from where I really wanted to start the keynote speech. The subject which I was given to speak about earthquake safety, which we keep talking and discussing both. I think yesterday I was able to watch on the live stream from the inaugural speech of Dr. 𝐀𝐬𝐥𝐚𝐦 𝐏𝐞𝐫𝐻 to many of the experts. Everyone certainly of the view is that earthquake safety is not only about how structure should behave, but at the same time looking at the entire risk landscape and how the enablers or the factors that actually may cause more losses and more damages are equally important. I think yesterday we also heard Shresthaji talking about social vulnerability, and currently I'm actually working with the ISC on a particular one, quantifying how we perceive on social vulnerabilities within the context of catastrophe. But for the topic, it's very difficult at this moment for me to establish in terms of does climate change really impact earthquake, or does climate change really the factor for earthquake? But let me come to that little bit. I come from a disaster preparedness, disaster risk reduction organization. The thing which we have been observing, and all of you observe that, and there is no denial. Those who deny, I think, are at loss, that the climate is changing rapidly. And if you look at statistics, I'm a statistician, so I always look through that. We have seen the impact of climate change are becoming more evident, with unusual weather event having becoming more norm rather than the exception. Just give you an example, last year when the Hatyai floods happened, and I think a lot of us were debating that how come suddenly within one day so much of rainfall that can take place. Later, Cyclone Ditwa, or even before that in Indonesia, what we saw is that instance rain can cause so much havoc. And that actually helps us also understand that the multi-dimensional, multi-hazard scenario is increasing. It is important for us to also remember that it is not the earthquake which kills people, it is the building, generally we say, kills people. But before coming here, and when I was discussing with somebody that what should I focus in this keynote speech, so a scientist view, which I am not, that climate change has nothing to do with earthquake. But yesterday, I think a lot of the debate, when I listened, I saw that no, that's not fully true. They generally compare between these two as an independent variable, but they also say that, okay, but when earthquake combines with heavy rain, then it could be disastrous. And this is exactly where I would like to focus. And his advice to me was not to correlate earthquake with climate change, because the former is the deep earth process driven by tectonic movement, and you heard yesterday. And the other one is more on a meteorological process. So I listened to him, but then when I was looking at the statistics back again, if you look at last year's data and the comparison between the last 20 years, the mortality from disasters caused by different type of hazards are increasing, but at the same time, when you look at with the economic losses, there are more incremental losses that we see from an annual average. Combining between mortality and economic loss, these are the two things in any society, any nation, that matters the most. Our economic losses and our mortality are the key indicator to decide how we develop and which way we need to develop. Based on these two type of statistics, I came up with my own take. And the first take and this is my personal interpretation, that no, climate extremes could however have a multiplier effect within the misery of the affected population could greatly increase. Those who actually has visited after the Sagai earthquake in those areas, you can actually correlate this with very much, that people affected by different type of stress, be it a natural disaster or any other political and non-political, and with the ever-increasing heat in Sagai area, you actually can relate that having an earthquake can multiply their misery more. The second one is that yes, climate change, and specifically the rising rainfall rates and the glacial melting could also exacerbate dangers beneath the Earth's surface, such as earthquake and volcanic eruption. We have seen in recent time in Indonesia. The third one, particularly in the context of our region here in Himalaya, where glaciers are receding fast and the size of the glacial lake is increasing at an alarming rate, earthquake could trigger a series of globes. And I think there is a lot of research, particularly with 𝐬𝐸 and others, being conducted, and that's true. The fourth one, which is more from a practitioner's perspective, what I have been able to understand at the spot level of hydromet or climate investment, is to force inject seismic safety concern in design and construction, and that is more important. And perhaps you can easily relate with this tall building in Chinese Taipei. This was my easiest bet as a damage from ground motion is directly on structural behavior. Coming back to the subject of earthquake safety for seismic resilience, the point that we always emphasize in our organization is to build seismic resilience through safety measures that we can do. At the same time, looking at the long-term action to integrate climate adaptation into seismic resilience planning for high-risk coastal and mountainous region. Some of the measures, perhaps you have debated, you will continue to discuss, is reinforce foundations and structures against combined hazards. There is no time left for us to look at single hazard or multi-hazard, but it has to be a combination of various hazards. Evacuation planning, I think there's a good examples both in this region and outside, but still a lot of evaluation has to be done, particularly to escape routes for susceptibility to floods, landslide, or sea level rise, because a lot of the mortality are due to these kind of things. Resilient kits, I think I learned NSET has developed too many and a lot of the materials, and what we continuously promote is this inclusive and responsive material for post-disaster isolation. Smaller, like a battery-operated torch is very much needed when something happens at the dark. Very quickly, on the conclusion part, and I purposely wrote to be concluded because I haven't yet concluded this one, is that earthquake safety measures, including the regulatory aspects that you have discussed yesterday, aren't easy if one does not make a targeted interventions to build seismic resilience. And let me just pause here for one moment. These are the two very important photographs. And between these two photographs, I found somewhere in February 2001, Richard Sharp is standing together with A.S. Arya on the first building, which was the hospital which was collapsed in Bhuj earthquake. And I was at that time working with UN, and the conversation between Dr. Richard Sharp, who is here in the room, and of course, Mr. Anand Sarup Arya, who is no more, but who always has been inspiration for a lot of earthquake engineers. the discussion was that, what we have done and that it happened. That means there must be something wrong that we have done that, this hospital building was collapsed. But the second photograph I certainly would like to attribute to Baker Consulting Firm and of course the leadership of Richard Sharp. That what you see here is the commitment not only by the engineers but by the policymakers, that if you really would like to target an intervention to build seismic resilience, you can actually achieve it. And today, those who visit Bhuj, you would still see this particular building, which is protected from earthquake by a lead rubber-based isolation system. I don't know much about this lead-based isolation system. I think Richard must have been explaining, but what lesson that we as a practitioner learn from this one is that if policymakers, if decision makers, together with the engineers and scientists can determine to make something happen, it will happen. And this is how this particular conference is very, very important when you talk about linking science to the people. Very quickly, some 5 points that I would like to share with you based on the lessons that ADPC has been learning, and I would like to also share with you that since the time that I come to know 𝐀𝐬𝐥𝐢 𝐏𝐞𝐫𝐰𝐚𝐬, we actually have about documented over the period of time with various collaboration about 20 different recovery and reconstruction process across Asia and the Pacific. And whenever I get a time, I actually visit them. I just heard Dr. Penang narrating the story that he went back to the place yesterday in Kathmandu Valley to see what he saw after the 2015 earthquake. One of the biggest lessons is about what materials that we choose. And I think the Gorkha earthquake demonstrated that if you really choose locally appropriate low carbon materials with both seismic strength and thermal performance, you actually can have a better seismic resilience. How much this can be true to an urban context, I think we, as a scientist, we continue to debate, but my feeling is that having a right material is very, very important. Last week I spent about 7 days in Japan, and just to learn in terms of some of these urban retrofitting. And I really was amazed that the kind of investment that the government of Japan, particularly the provincial government, is putting, combining seismic strengthening with insulation and end-tightness improvement, that really actually brings a lot of co-benefits. And this is important for us to really see that we should see retrofitting both from an investment as well as from a benefit perspective. The third one we already emphasized is about multi-hazard design. I think we must continue to aspire to address earthquake alongside with other hazards. And it was too much true in Sikkim, it was too much true in Uttarakhand, in repeated kind of disasters. I'm not saying that earthquake will always happen, but you have seen the cloudburst, the incessant rain actually brings. So I think our housing construction must have these design in place and implemented. We also talk about the design and the implementation. In between comes how best we build capacity of our building contractors and the masons. One of the lessons that we have learned that masons training in most of the place has become occasional than regular, whereas, as you know, that for the livelihood purpose, this particular group we call masons has the high turnaround. Today they are masons, tomorrow they go and do farming. we must invest a lot of our efforts continuously to train these people who actually touch the mortar, cement, and the steel, while a good design by all of you is important. At the same time, it is important also for us to build those training capacity of the masons all the time. Last couple of slides. Safe detailing, as we say that for urban high-rise building, it is important to ensure insulations and retrofit do not weaken the structural connections. In the event of the Myanmar earthquake, some of the impact that we felt in Bangkok city on that day was that you have to be very, very careful when you have a good structural design, but you should not weaken it by having some of those extra things to be applied to it. I think the last one is more about that we all aspire to live in a comfortable life, and for that one, I think this life cycle value, which is durable, affordable solutions that improve safety, comfort, and emission in the long term is very, very important. So these are primarily my 5 key takeaways from this earthquake safety in the context of climate change. And I just wanted to end here, which I purposely put it in a very, very low font size, just to ensure that this particularly needs to be magnified and scaled all the time, because when disaster strikes, the time to prepare has already passed. And who other than Dr. Penang, who will be speaking just after me, knows it, that in Bangkok metropolitan area, I think for almost 30 years that I know, Dr. Penang has been continuously, tirelessly talking and asking people to prepare for structural or seismic one. But when we felt the tremor, some of the damages, luckily Bangkok was safe for some major, except for some other faulty reason. So it is important for us to invest time, invest our finances, to improve the disaster preparedness, so that when something happens, we certainly would be able to ensure that the mortality and the economic losses are reduced. Thank you very much for your time.